Welcome back. I'm Bill. I've got something interesting today, something we don't see up here in Canada because as far as I know they weren't sold up here. This is a KampLite model LRL-21B lantern. The KampLites were made by the American Gas Machine Company of Albert Lea, Minnesota, beginning in 1949 and ending in 1960. And before I get into this lantern, it seems like this is a good opportunity to talk about some of that history. In the middle of the 20th century, there were a bunch of buyouts and mergers and all of that. And so, whereas before World War II, you had a host of companies making lanterns and stoves, Akron and Princess Webers and Coleman. Coleman was kind of the one that survived. And part of that was because all of these companies were being bought and sold during that time. And in the late 40s, AGM was purchased by Queen Stove Works, which was also based in Albert Lea, Minnesota. AGM continued under their own name at that point. They continued making products with the American Gas Machine name on them. Some of them actually do mention Queen Stove in some places. But as part of that, they did this rebranding thing with the KampLite and the KampCold and the KampCook. And they changed the livery and color scheme eventually. I'll get to that just in a little bit here. In the late 50s, they were bought out. Queen Stove was bought out by the King Sealy Corporation. Again, they continued with the products under the American Gas Machine name through 1960. In 1960, King Sealy bought Thermos. And Thermos had their own line of lanterns and stoves, which I think part of the reason for this was because the Thermos line, the styling looked more in keeping with what was popular with other styling at that time in the late 50s and early 60s. So King Sealy then produced the Thermos line and cut the others, and the factory in Albert Lea, Minnesota, where AGM had made their lanterns and stoves, was converted, and that was where they began making Scotsman ice machines. So the AGM name, the KampLite brand, and all of that was no more. Now everybody wants to know about dating these because American Gas Machines didn't stamp anything like Coleman did, so there are no dates on their products. So we can talk about the lanterns here, and it is possible to get some rough dates. Again, they began with the KampLite line in 1949, and initially they kept the same color scheme that they had had on their previous lanterns. So you've got a burgundy vent, burgundy fount, burgundy collar. They also kept some of these other distinctive AGM identifiers like the lobed knob. And so they used this livery or color scheme until about 1953 or 1954. In 1954, they switched to this red and black color scheme. Now, within this range, there are some variations to help narrow it down because they used this red and black color scheme from 1954 through 1959. So that was a fairly long time period. Some of the things that disappeared were the lobed valve knob, and they've got this knurled valve knob with the ridges on it. They used that throughout, but the easiest way to narrow these down by date is the pump handle. So you see this has a hexagon-shaped pump handle that's dished in the middle. You'll see this also has the same hexagon pump handle. This was later, this was toward the end of the line. The earlier ones, I know, this is sad. I was really hopeful when I picked this up that I could perhaps deconvert it. Someone's electrified it. Public service announcement, my friends. If you have to electrify a lantern and it's still in good shape, do it non-invasively. It is possible to do. This poor little guy, I don't know what they did to it. They ran the power cord in through the fuel cap, which is what I saw in the photos, and I thought, oh, I've got some parts, I think I can fix that and just replace the fuel cap. But for some reason, they drilled a big hole in the back and then put this badge over the top to cover it up. So I don't know if they changed directions partway through. I'm taking donations and parts to get this guy running if anybody wants to contact me and send me anything for it. But this is a good example. This has a pump handle that's very much like what you would see on a Coleman. It's the same as what AGM was using prior to this in the 1940s. They used this style pump handle in 1954 and into 1955. So you can date them that way. In approximately 1955, they switched pump handles, and I do not have one of these on me, but I will find a picture and I will put it up here. You'll see it's very similar to this hexagon-shaped handle, except it's round. It's just round and it's dished in the middle. And they used that in 1955 approximately. And then between 1956 and 1959, they went to this hexagon-shaped pump handle. Now, if you happen to see one that's got a plastic dished pump handle, that's not American Gas Machines. That's a Unimet, and they copied AGM's design, and rather than a metal round dish pump handle, they put a plastic handle on it. And if it's an actual Unimet lantern, it'll be pretty unmistakable because it will say Unimet and made in Hong Kong. But Unimet also made lanterns like this for J.C. Higgins, Sears in-house sporting goods line. So some of them will have AGM features, some of them will have Unimet features, but they'll all look virtually identical. So plastic handle is not AGM, that's Unimet. Now, the red and black color scheme was replaced in 1960 for the final year, and they went to this, it's a spattered, speckled, not really marbled, it's off-white, and it's got this paint spattered on here. You can feel it, it's fairly rough. And they have these salmon-colored vents. So they made these for just 1 year in 1960, and then after that, AGM was no more, and King Sealy just put out the Thermos line. Now, during this time with the KampLites, they basically had, at any given time, essentially four different basic designs through those years. And again, there's a plethora of model numbers that can be quite confusing, but they had the small single, which in many cases is a lot like, say, a Coleman 200. It's got a vent that's virtually identical to a Coleman 242 vent. All of these have essentially the same valve setup, except for the earliest of them. But even then, the valves are very similar. But there's always a small single like this. And then, based on the same design, but with a larger burner cage and a wider vent, and usually white enameled on the bottom like a Coleman 228, there's a large single. Now, the inner workings on these are essentially identical. It's just a larger lantern, and I think they have a larger fount. If we put them next to each other, maybe they're the same size. But so they had a small single and a large single. And then they also, throughout that time period, also had a double mantle lantern. I think these were mainly to compete directly with Coleman's 220. And you've seen other videos I've done with this design, so I won't get into that too much. Again, the valve is essentially the same as on these other twos. There are some evolutions in the valve over the years, but they remain fairly similar, and they're not quite the same as a Coleman valve, but they accomplish the same thing. So during that time, you've got small single, big single, and a double mantle lantern that's very much like a Coleman 220. I do not have one to show you here, so I'll see if I can find a photo to put up, but there was also the inverted lantern, and that had a donut-shaped tank at the top that was painted in whatever the color scheme of the time was, and then it had a globe inside a cage that hung down on the bottom with the mantle on the bottom. So instead of having a fount here and delivering fuel and air up to a mantle in the top and having the light shine down, you would suspend this lantern, and the light source was underneath, so you'd get a full 360 degrees of light underneath it. They're kind of neat. So this guy, he'll need some work. I bought this to do a full restoration. I know the paint and the decal aren't really that bad, and I'd probably be okay with it if I just cleaned it up and degreased it and polished it. But I bought this to do a full restoration. It's the collars, most of the paint's burned off the collar. It's missing the globe, but the good thing is the globes that came on these are exactly the same size as a Coleman 550 that would be used on a 200 or 242, so it's easily replaced. The fuel cap has been replaced. This would have had a nickel-plated fuel cap. Someone's put like a 200 or 400 series stove cap on here, but again, easy to remedy. This is a Coleman vent nut, again, easy to remedy. And yeah, I think that, oh, and we're missing the bail. This is a bail off of a Coleman 200 as well, but again, that I can remedy. So, We'll tear into this and look at the inner workings and do a full restoration on it. So let me reposition the camera and put some gloves on and we'll tear into it. Let's start with the vent. I've got there's always a little bin here to put parts in so that they don't get lost. I'll take this bail off. That bail doesn't go on here. And let's get rid of our mantle. Again, this is a number 21. It is too small for this guy. If you were in an emergency situation, it would get the job done, but it doesn't run very well with it. Now, this screw here holds things together. This is a 7/16. It just screws into a hole in the top of the valve. We'll get that in a second. And then this whole thing lifts off and things will sort of fall apart here really quickly. So as we lift this off, this is our air tube. This is the air tube. This is the generator. And then this is our mixing tube, a mixing chamber that goes up into the manifold. So as we lift this off, it goes over the generator nut. You'll see this separates from our air tube. And the air tube, you'll notice, take it out now, just got a hole here and it just sits over the top of the generator like that. And everything has to be adjusted properly in order for this to all fit together right and not be wonky. So this is just sucking in air from inside the collar here. Fuel comes up through the generator. They mix as they pass through here. They run up through this tube into the manifold, and then they come out here at the burner head. Now you'll notice the burner head is actually cast. This is all one piece up here, and the burner head's cast into that, and there's no burner screen in it, which means that when you turn one of these off, it's going to make some pops when it shuts off. The burner screens help prevent that on other lanterns. It doesn't affect how this runs, but it will shut down noisily. Now, these screws on the bottom here are 1/4 inch. They're easiest to take off with a socket. Let's see if I can do it left-handed. And this will allow the base plate to come off. Now, that comes off, and these will usually unscrew. You may need some oil, maybe even depending on how crusty it is, you may even need some heat on there. Now, one suggestion I have, depending on how much work you want to do to make this fiddly to put back together, is to leave these in place. Sometimes these will actually, in fact, these are moving really freely. So I'm going to document, before I take these off, I'll take them off later, I'm going to document exactly how far on those are threaded, because putting this all back together, all these things need to be adjusted properly. So if you take these off and don't make a reference point and then you just screw them back on all the way up to the top, your manifold's going to be sitting too low. Things won't fit together right. So if you take these off, document how far they were threaded back on. Or if they're crusty and don't want to move, just leave them in place. So this, probably break it free. There we go. The same goes for this tube here. This screw may be rusted and stuck. It may need some heat or some penetrating oil to get it out. But if you do take this apart, make sure you document how far this is threaded in, or it'll be a bear to put back together. See how badly this is stuck. Oh, that's not stuck at all, so that's really good. So we'll just take that little screw out, and this guy turns, so I'm going to document how far that's threaded in. So I can see 3 3 full threads there. And we'll unscrew it and set it aside. The vent stud, I would just leave in place. I think since it's got hex on there, it should unscrew. I've never unscrewed one. I don't believe it's cast in place, but we can get in here with a brush and clean everything. We don't need to take that out, and you're likely to break something if you do. This is one piece. It's crimped together, so that's as far as that part goes. And now the generator. I think this is a 9/16. Nope, it's a 5/8. These are big and chunky. These are designed to burn unleaded as well as white gas. Our nut comes off. You want to be careful with these. The insides may not come out easily, and that's okay. You probably don't want to take it apart any further than this. If the packing will come out, there's asbestos and a spring in there. Feel free to take it out and clean everything, but I wouldn't stress too much about it. If the guts inside there won't come out, just leave it, because these are unobtainium now. So we'll just rotate the tip cleaner up and pull that out. Our needle looks good. Like most AGMs, these just have a notch around the bottom, and we'll see the tip cleaner has a little claw in there that grabs onto it. So our collar rotates up like that, and we just work it back around the tip cleaning actuator. There's our other screw. So we've got here model LRL-21B. So the 21A, in fact, I think all of the A variants were made in 1955, if I understand correctly. So I already know the 21B is going to be 1956 to 1959. Let's see if I can actually read this. It's in pretty rough shape. White ore leaded fuel. White ore leaded fuel, American Gas Machine Company, division of Queen Stove Incorporated, Albert Lea, Minnesota. So leaded gas, these will burn leaded gas, but of course it's not an issue today, but it really isn't recommended. It will clog up the generator much more quickly. So now we'll put a screwdriver in here. This one might be a little bit too big. May want to put that back in later. We'll see. So I want to take the whole valve apart. And this is a 9/16. That unscrewed quite easily. That's good. So we'll just take this packing nut off. Let the pressure out. Sometimes pressure builds up in these when they've been sitting. Just keep unscrewing, and with that packing nut off, the valve stem should just come right out. I'll have to pull on it, so I should have waited to take that screw off. There we go. Now we can take that screw out. So on this, just put some big pliers on there. This is one place where and I'm going to turn it on its side. It's a steel fountain, so I'm not worried about crushing it. This is one place where you might find a lantern fountain vise useful. And usually these aren't too bad. There we go. unscrew it. If you're not filming it, make sure you document the proper clocking. Or in this case, it's not too bad because we know the valve knob goes over the decal. Now we're going to clean that off, but fuel cap on the left and pump on the right. So here is our valve, and it doesn't look half bad. It's very similar to Coleman by this generation. So this fuel and air tube, just grab it with pliers, and it should just unscrew. So the earlier ones had a little spring-loaded pip in the back here that was pressed in and out by the valve stem, and that controlled the airflow for their equivalent to the instant light circuit. This, by now, this is essentially the same as a Coleman. So you've got a metering rod in here, an air wire, and you've got the spring on it, and of course the valve wheel, or the valve stem pushes that up and down like in a Coleman. And you've got a fuel and air tube, double walled, so air goes in the top, comes down the bottom. You've got this tiny little orifice down here. Fuel leaks in through that when the valve is cracked open, but doesn't come flooding in. And as the air rushes down the outer tube and then back up the inner tube and out the top here into the valve, it picks up the little bit of fuel that's leaking in through that hole. So, I'm going to make sure this tip is clean. And I believe on these, it just unscrews, but I also don't want to break it. I believe it does. Or it might not. So for now, I'll leave it that way. I may have to look that up. I know on the later ones, they came off, but this, it may not. It may be soldered on there or something. So we'll leave that like it is for now. We can still clean through there. The main thing is to use a cleaning needle like from the generator to clean out that little orifice and make sure it's clean. And now the tip cleaner, it's not critical that that come off, but since we're here, we might as well. You can get everything cleaned and polished. Don't take the tip cleaner apart any more than this, just leave it the way it is here. There's a graphite packing inside here, and it's not really easily serviceable by an end user. This whole assembly, like on a Coleman 220 or 200, was meant just to be replaced. And our eccentric block comes out, and as is usual on AGMs, it's just like it's a claw. And where is our... show you how this works. You've got this circular notch down here, and that just fits into the claw, and then it moves up and down. And yeah, and that's the last of the valve. We can clean that out. The last thing is the pump. There should be a screw in the top and bottom, or at least in one of those places. These are missing, not a problem. We just pull that off and then unscrew the pump itself, and it pulls out. And unscrew this. Sometimes it won't be that easy. These are different than Coleman. Coleman has an air stem in there. These do not. So whereas on a Coleman, the air stem is threaded and screws into the check valve to seal it. On an AGM, the actual pump itself screws in to seal it. So we've got our pump leather, and this is in good shape. It's nice and oily. They have this spring-loaded brass insert in there to keep it from collapsing, and so on these AGMs, the pump leather is usually in good shape and salvageable. There's a little tiny little washer in here, a spacer that goes inside the leather. And then there's a backing plate on here. On some earlier AGMs it will actually thread on. This is just a washer. And then we've got our spring and our cap and the pump handle itself. cleaned up here. The next part. Now, the check valve is down here. You probably will not be able to see that. Oh, this looks really nasty, which explains a bit. All you should need on these is a big screwdriver. This is my big screwdriver. I actually bought this just to work on AGM check valves. So you want some good light, and you want to look down there and see that there's a slot in the check valve. Get your screwdriver lined up, get a good grip, and make sure you're straight because these are brass and you don't really want to slip. But AGM check valves usually aren't as tight as Coleman check valves are. And there it is. So these are a simpler design than the early ones. The earlier ones have a part that screws in and out. This simply threads in. This is more like a Coleman. The earlier ones have like a blade on the end, and that blade opens and closes the check valve itself. This is simpler. And it is rattling, but this thing is really dirty, so I want to make sure I clean that out so that we know everything's working. So there we are. Everything's completely disassembled. I will take some of these parts to the sink to clean them with soap and water, and other parts we'll put into citric acid to degrease and de-rust and de-tarnish and all of that. So I will see you in the kitchen. Let's get this fount cleaned up. I've already checked, and the inside is good, so I don't want to get it wet to encourage rust. I'm not going to put the whole thing in citric acid or anything like that. So I just want to clean it up. So I plugged the bung, put the fuel cap back on, and I actually did put the check valve back in loosely. And I'm just going to use Simple Green. This stuff's good for cleaning and degreasing. It will damage paint if left on too long, but in this case I'm not too worried about that. Alright, I'll just try that. Mainly I just want to see what this looks like on top. I'm definitely going to use a wire wheel to remove the paint and hopefully smooth some of this out, and then reduce the amount of sanding I need to do to prep it. Same on the bottom here, it's got some rough spots. But mainly I just need to degrease it so it doesn't make a mess when I'm stripping it. Simple Green is great on the sooty underside of vents. Alright, that's it for the soap and water part of the job. Once again, I'm making lantern soup. Here are the brass parts in one pan, and I've got the steel and nickel plated parts in this other pan, so they don't pickle each other. I'm using a mixture of water and citric acid. The citric acid powder, I get it at a local beer and wine making store. I mix it up about 1 teaspoon per liter of water. So in each of these cases, probably between half and 2/3 of a teaspoon in each of these pans. One nice thing you'll notice with the steel parts, since there's no large burner cage on this one, I can put everything pretty easily into one fairly small pan. So that makes this easier. So I will see you when we're done. We'll clean these up with some 4/0 steel wool. I've taken these parts out of the citric acid. I'm going to rub them all down with some 4/0 fine steel wool, and then we'll take them to the buffing room. here's the generator. I was not able to pull that out. I could probably heat and quench it a bunch of times and get it out, but since these are unobtainium, I don't want to damage anything. I know it's working, so I'm just cleaning the outside. I'm not going to worry about the inside. I'm going to make sure that the jet is clean, and that'll be good to go. One thing, because it's got that asbestos packing in it, it needs to be dry before we put it back on the lantern. So you could let it sit for a few days. You could heat it with a blowtorch before you install it, or I've got some parts to dry in the oven, so I'll probably just put it in there for a while. Okay, we've got our bin of cleaned parts now. I'm going to polish these. A few things have been polished already with the wire wheel, but most of these I'll use some polishing compound. I'm using this white compound and cotton buffing wheel. Gives you an idea. I'm going to finish the rest of these parts and I'll see you when I'm done. Let's strip some paint here. If you've seen some of my more recent videos, you found I'm kind of liking this wire wheel. It's great on steel founts. It removes paint probably faster than messing with paint stripper, especially since decent paint stripper is hard to find and expensive when you do find it these days. It takes care of a lot of this roughness. So yeah, I'm just going to put a respirator on. I've got an old jacket on with long sleeves because it does get dusty, and we'll take this off. So that's the top. That's a lot faster than paint stripper. A lot less hassle too. All right, there we go. We just need to do some sanding, so I'll finish up with the collar and we'll be done. So we've got the paint stripped off. It's pretty good. It's got more pitting. I've got a few little spots of paint that need to come off with sanding, but it's got some pitting here and there. It's got some roughness around the top. So I'm going to start out by sanding dry with some 150 grit sandpaper, and when that's done, I will use some 400 grit sandpaper to prepare it for primer. Run my hands around, and I'll do it one more time with my gloves off when I'm done. So it's too bad. You can actually see ridges here, the marks from the shaping. It'd be nice to sand those out, but that would be too much. So and the bottom, as much as it doesn't look great, the bottom feels very good. So I think the fount's good to go, and I will just work on the collar here a bit. All right, let's spray this with some primer. I'm using some trim clad, just some gray, plain gray primer, and I'll hit this with probably 2 coats. I think we'll probably do it, but we'll see once we've got 2 coats on there. All right, second coat of primer. So this is 2 coats of primer. It is dry. It feels pretty good, but I'm going to wet sand it with some 1000 grit and make sure everything's smooth and prepped for the color coat. This feels smooth until you wet sand it, then you feel it again. It does make a big difference. All right. That's very smooth now. If this were a brass fount, I would probably just shoot it with the color coat and the results would be fine. If it were a steel fount and it was, I stripped it, or I was able to sand the original paint and get it smooth to begin with, I would probably just shoot it with a color coat. But this had enough pitting on it, it had enough roughness, especially up here on the top, from some rust and all of that, that it's worth hitting it with primer. But again, if it's a brass fount or something and it's nice and smooth, it's usually not necessary. So I'm going to follow up with the collar as well. I don't want to go too hard on this, especially where the lettering is or the stamping, because if I let the primer fill in the stamping and then sand it off, you won't be able to read the stamping when I hit it with the color coat. So I just want to wet sand it enough just to knock down any roughness. All right, time for the color coat. I'm using, again, some trim clad. This is Fire Red. It's probably not the most perfect match, but it's pretty close, and considering the vent doesn't have to match because the vent is black, I think it will be sufficient. So probably 3 coats of this. We'll start with a light coat.
give that somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes to set, and then do a second coat. Here goes coat number 2. On to coat number 3, and I think this will do it. The fount turned out very nice. I like how the paint came out. It's nice and glossy, shiny, looks great. So let's start putting this thing back together. Proper fuel cap on there. And we'll start with the pump, and that means starting with the check valve. There's a slot here, so we'll just put it on a big screwdriver and lined up. There we go. Lost the. There we go. All right, now tighten it down. Easier than a Coleman, definitely. So we've got our pump. We've got the cap and the spring. And somewhere here we've got a little screw to hold that on. And then our other pieces here. I'll get a paper towel since we've got some grease. Our pump leather and the backer. So let's try it this way. Cap, spring, backer. Oh, and we've got a little washer here that helps keep the pump cup centered on there, and then the nut. And we want to make sure that's tight so it doesn't fall off down at the bottom. It's always a pain when that happens. And we'll add some oil. This is nice and soft. There's oil on there. I'll just add a little bit. I'm using 3-in-1 oil. Neat's Foot oil is sort of the factory thing. Pretty much anything but a vegetable-based oil. And just slide that in. Excess oil off your hands, cleaning the excess off there. Down it goes. Get the holes in the cap lined up. And put the screw in. This was missing both screws. So since our electrified KampLite won't be needing any screws, I borrowed one from it. And the pump is working. Screw that down for now. Keeps going and going and going. There we go. Now we need to put our valve together before we can put it in the fount. So we've got our valve, eccentric block, our metering rod and spring, the tip cleaner assembly, our fuel and air tube, and our valve stem, and I think that's all of it. So let's start with our eccentric block. This notch needs to interface with this on the tip cleaner assembly. So I'll slide this in through the top. And if I push it down, not too far, and I'm lucky, hopefully this will just catch the notch. I think I got lucky there. I can feel it. And we'll check. See, yep, we're going up and down. So tighten that. Thought that was a 3/8, but it's smaller. Now for our fuel and air assembly. Remember the spring goes on the bottom of that shoulder. And that rod goes in there. And when we push it down, you can see the wire poking through the tip. Now, I could swear the last one of these I took apart, the tip came off. I did some research on the internet and didn't really come up with any good answers. I do see solder down here now that it's cleaned. So it may be soldered on. I tried to turn it off with some pliers, and I used as much force as I was comfortable using, and it didn't budge. So I just left it on there. I don't want to break it. If I were in the States, I could probably find another one, but in Canada, that's very unlikely to happen. And we'll just tighten that up. And then we'll put our valve stem in, and that just screws in. Got the packing's not quite down all the way. There we go. Get this started. Not the easiest thing. Let's try to cinch it down a little bit more there, and then just back it off just enough to loosen it. You can turn it, and I think we've got it going now. And that is a 5/8. If the packing is bad, you can, maybe that's a 9/16. There we go. Oh, that's too tight. Still a little tight, but I think it'll loosen up once we get some heat on there. See, that's too loose. Okay, that's our valve assembly. Yes, we've got everything on there and the eccentric block is working. So we can put this back in the fount. We want it clocked like that. Pump on your right and fuel cap over here and the valve stem in between. I'm going to use some Permatex blue thread sealant on this just to play it safe. Don't need a lot. There we go. Just in case it isn't tight or tight enough when we get it clocked the way it needs to be, that will make sure it doesn't leak. Almost. I just had a little technical glitch there. You didn't miss anything other than me saying I was going to put the fountain down and go wash my hands so I could put this decal on. So cameras run out of space occasionally, so that's what happened. So let's put this decal on. It goes right here underneath the valve wheel. This is a reproduction. You can buy them from Old Coleman Parts. I'm not sure if anybody else sells them, but that's the place I know of. Oops. They really are the thing that makes the restoration beautiful, the finishing touch. So now put our collar on. So to figure out which hole this goes through, it's going to go through the big one here. So we just slide that over, and it kind of sits on this particular fount. Usually the shoulder up here sits inside the collar on most lanterns. On this, the collar just sits on top of it. And we'll put our generator on. So we've got the tip, and I noticed the needle is slightly bent. I want to straighten that out. That's better. And our jam nut. So the tip cleaner or the eccentric block doesn't come up all that far, but far enough we can get that in and then locked down, and then very carefully slide the generator body over and put the jam nut on. There we go. Before I tighten that down, check to see if the tip cleaner is working. Yes, it's poking up there. That's good. And we will tighten that down. Now we need to put the burner assembly together. So we've got a number of parts here. These supports, the base plate, the mixing tube, set screw, and then we've got these four nuts that hold everything together. So first, let's screw these in. The shorter threads go up into the manifold. And those just tighten up however much they need to. Now, I made a note that these were actually right smack in the middle, like that. That's right. And now, so this is going to sit on here like that. So we'll go ahead and put this together while we're at it. This had three threads, I guess you could call it, exposed. That. Place. So this is our air tube that sits on there like that. And actually, now that I'm looking at this, I can see the holes for the uprights are the smaller ones, so it's going to go like that. So we can take this off for now and know that it lines up this way. Put the nuts on. And somewhere here I've got a little 1/4 inch driver. Now, these are brass. They need to be snug. But if you try to make them really tight, because they're so small, you'll split them. So just snug them up. And put all this together. It still may need some fine tuning. That definitely needs some fine tuning there. So I will loosen this screw and I will hold this down. Until we've got a nice solid fit there. Okay, and then I will retighten this. And then we just put the central nut in place, and that will lock it all together. Collar is where we want it. Oops. Now, before we go any further, let's put our mantle on. Now, like I said earlier, this had a number, like a Coleman number 21 on it, which is too small. It sat right up here, so it's not hanging down around here and sitting next to the generator, which means it takes a long time for it to heat up, for the generator to heat up, and it keeps, it'll keep flaring up. It'll settle down, flare up, settle down, flare up, over and over and over. Eventually it will settle down, but I've noticed, especially if you're using them in cold temperatures, sometimes they never really do completely settle down. Having the globe and vent on will help, but the 21 is just too small, and you won't get the full brightness out of it because it's too small. So on these, you want to use either a Coleman 99 or a Peerless 24A. And I think you could actually probably also get away with a Coleman 111 if you really wanted to, especially one of the older ones. Before we forget, we'll put our direction disc on. All right, so I am going to burn in this mantle, fill this with fuel, and when I come back, we'll be ready to put the globe on and the vent and fire it up. We're gassed up, the mantle's burned in. Let's put some pressure in this. Enough. Now I'm going to crack the valve and listen for the hiss and then the sputter of fuel, just because the fuel system's bone dry. Sometimes it can take a little bit for the fuel to get to the generator. Oh, but it's right there. I didn't have to wait at all. So hopefully this will be easy to light. There's a little opening here for that. And there we go. Sometimes they're fussy on the first light up. Try that again. These do, because they've got that big chunky generator, they take a little bit longer to heat up. And I think we're good. Check here. No gas leaks from the packing. And with these Peerless mantles, I don't know why, but these new Peerless mantles need to get a good 4 or 5 minutes on them before they really start to lighten up and put out the light they're supposed to. I don't know why, that just seems to be the first time you light them up. So I'm going to add some pressure, and we'll let this sit for a few minutes, and I'll come back. Time it took me to put away my tools and clean up the table, the mantle's burning nice and bright. So these are not quiet lanterns, but they are very reliable and they are very bright. Really nice lantern. Let me cut the lights out. That turned out very nicely. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time.